gratified to see such a good turnout because I have been working on this for nearly 8 months. On March 3rd, the so-called Rockefeller Brothers Fund gave $100,000 to Bill McKibben and his group called 350.org to do a day of international climate action on October 29th. And currently, there are approximately 4,600 other, quote, actions. They're not really actions, they're gestures or games. And they're all spinning off from the original $100,000 from the Rockefellers. I'll get into this a bit more between speakers. I'm eager to bring on Brian. I thought I would take a couple minutes to do a brief auto bio so you have a basis for deciding whether you trust a couple of assertions that I'd like to make. It's a little bit complicated for me to introduce myself because of something that happened to me during the second half of 1957 when, through nepotism, tisk tisk, I had a job as a Paris-based correspondent accredited to NATO for William Randolph Hearst's notorious international news service, which historically was one of the forerunners to today's Fox News. And my education during the maybe 6 months that I was able to stand the job without losing too much self-respect, the main education was they weren't paying me very much, hardly more than expenses, but they were bribing me with increments of fame. Every time my byline would appear anywhere on the planet, e.g. the Hong Kong Standard, it would be rushed to me via diplomatic pouch to feed my ego and keep me obedient to their right-wing corporate values. So I developed quite a suspicion of fame, and for the past few decades, I've used 3 different names. For example, I was one of the founders of the U.S. environmental movement in '69 under my original name, Keith Lampy. But then in 1972, I started what was evidently the planet's first biocentric press relations firm, Living Creatures Associates, under the name Ronunsote, which had been given to me by a Mohawk poet and carver after he had become convinced that I was one of those in the Wowoka ghost dance prophecy who would reincarnate, quote, with blue eyes or green eyes to infiltrate the culture of the European invaders on North America. Then in 1978, with my partner of that period, Olive Tree, we were an all-tree couple because I used the name Ponderosa Pine for that particular event. And it allowed me to avoid fame. Whenever one name would appear too frequently in the media, I could always slip into something more comfortable. So, during the first of my 4 or 5 trips around the world in 1953 and 54, I began to feel quite strongly that the central problem on this planet is what we call Occidental civilization, sometimes also referred to as the Western world, sometimes referred to as the Judeo-Christian heritage. And so I spent the 56-57 academic year doing graduate work in the University of Copenhagen, studying Søren Kierkegaard, because I felt that he was providing certain stepping stones out of what I call the Occidental syndrome. His critique was that the Occident had been suckered into what he called abstract thought, capital A, capital T, and that we desperately needed to replace it with what he called passionate inwards. Under the abstract thought condition, the neocortex, a wafer-thin organism weighing only a couple ounces, dominates the entire body. which weighs maybe 1,000 times more than it. But under the notion of passionate inwardness, you end up something similar to certain references in Buddhist literature to thinking being a sixth sense. We touch, taste, think, feel, hear, and see. And so, now a few decades later, we can see the plight of the Occident more clearly. Here we have this horrendous climate emergency, and all the Occident has been able to do since the information became available approximately 40 years ago. I mean, I've been absorbed in this since 1967, when my friend Allen Ginsberg, whom I hung out with a bit in Calcutta in '62, came back from the Dialectics of Liberation conference in London, where he had listened to a guy named Gregory Bateson talking about the melting of the polar caps and the inundation of the continents. I can't quite remember his time frame. I think it was 30 or 40 years. So maybe it's proceeding somewhat more slowly, but not much. So what we see now is that in the face of this emergency, the oxen is like a deer trapped in headlights. It can't move. And so we have to say the oxen needs help from the outside. And there are two very important places to get this help. One is from the traditional wisdoms in the indigenous cultures, especially those wisdoms leading to sustainable agricultural practices. And also, very importantly, information about sexual roles in certain indigenous cultures. I'm sure some of you have seen a couple of really interesting paragraphs from John Perkins' latest book, where he talks about a bunch of Shuar going up to the U.S. from the Amazon here and looking around and being tremendously appalled by how much had been paved over, how much filthy industry, how much pavement. And they said, "Where are your women? Where are your women?" Because in Shuar culture, the role of the woman is similar to what we call eco-steward, or what we might call eco-feminist. If the males get a little too rambunctious cutting trees and stuff, it's the role of the female to step in and moderate it. So we really urgently need that now. And the good news in terms of this important topic of the indigenous cultures is that our own Lucia Gallardo will soon cover this right here in Vilcabamba, probably at the community center. And the other tremendously important source is post-Occidental science, which brings me to none other but Dr. Brian O'Leary, who is a former U.S. astronaut, former Cornell astronomy professor, Princeton physics professor, and a founder of the free energy movement several years ago. And in that role, he did a lot of traveling on our behalf, checking out promising inventions. He visited Inomata in Japan and Tewari in India, just for a couple of examples. And he is also the author of several books, most recently, The Energy Solution Revolution. So I'm going to get out of here and turn this over quickly to Dr. Brian O'Leary.